Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. I wanted to take a moment before we start to say thank you for all the support and positive feedback on the podcast. One recent comment from @YoveerGill stood out, which highlighted finding a mentor in Enter the Boardroom. If anyone listening is interested in finding a traditional, in-person mentor, do consider joining the Nurole board community, which you can find at community.nurole.com. For just £29 a month, we have created a space where you can get matched with a mentor, as well as learn, grow your board network, and tap into the hive mind of over 60,000 board members in real time. Today's guest, Jennifer Sundberg, is co-CEO of Board Intelligence, a board management software and advisory company she co-founded with Pippa Begg in 2009. Over 3,000 companies and 40,000 directors use their products in boardrooms around the world. Holding an MA in Classics and Management Studies from the University of Cambridge, Jennifer is co-author of Collective Intelligence, How to Build a Business That's Smarter Than You, featured as an FT Book of the Month. Jennifer, a huge welcome and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to get straight in there with a question for you, which is, do boards still matter?
Power corrupts. Power doesn't just corrupt. Too much power concentrated in any one person or group makes you stupid. Borne out throughout history, right? From Icarus to modern day examples like Sam Bankman-Fried. Eventually, too much power, you fly too close to the sun, and boards are a check and balance, and I think pretty vital check and balance. I think for any management team to perform well in the long run, they need to subject themselves to that healthy check and balance, scrutiny, challenge. But there is a reason why the book we have just published is called Collective Intelligence and not Board Intelligence. And that's because whilst I do believe that boards still matter, absolutely, for those reasons I just shared, I don't think it stops there. When we scan across our customer base, it became quite apparent that our most successful clients were the ones whose decision-making centre of gravity was as far away from the boardroom as possible. If all of the really important decisions in your organisation have to roll up to your board, then in this day and age, where it's not the big that eat the small, it's the fast that eat the slow, you're just not going to move fast enough. And so to succeed as an organisation, yes, I believe the board matters. Yes, I believe you do need a board that is capable of operating well at full pelt, but you also need to empower everyone at every level of your organisation to think well and take smart decisions, not just the board.
You unpack that for me a little bit more in practical details, because I guess on the one hand, what I'm hearing you say is you need everyone to be fully empowered at the individual level and those closest to the coalface. And on the other hand, you're saying actually the board does matter. So where does that line get drawn?
I suppose a lot of organisations rely on things like the sum of the quantum of money at stake, which is often a pretty poor measure of whether the board is capable of adding value or even scrutinising the decision, right? But it's almost the least bad way of doing it. It's a model, I suppose. It's a measure of the risk at stake of a poor decision. But I think more time spent on working out, have we got that line right? Are there better, more meaningful ways of determining when the decision needs to be tabled in the board, or whether the board simply needs to be assured that the decision has been taken in the right way? A lot of the time, the solution is seen as creating lots of committees, right? They perceive there to be too much in the board agenda, so they spin it out into lots of either start and finish groups or long-standing committees. But I think the better is to build an operating model where you do have confidence in the quality of the thinking capability and the rigour of the senior leadership team and the many, many rungs below. So a good example would be actually Timpson's. So John Timpson, we pitched to him once, very unsuccessfully. He came into our office and he let us get about 5 slides into our deck, setting out how we could help him to build a stronger, better board before he held his hand up like he was trying to stop traffic. And he said, I don't need a better board. I don't need a stronger board. The most important decisions in my business are not made in my boardroom. They're made on the shop floor. And he's a very firm advocate that the people who are closest to the customer, closest to the data points around which you can formulate a decision, and closest to the group who they most need to impact, that they are the people who should take as many decisions as possible and be empowered by every level of management above them. So he describes what he describes as upside down management, where it is the job of every level of the management team to support the layer below, empower, enable, upskill.
Do you think that varies depending on the business type? Because for a business like Timpson's, that makes a lot of sense to me. But I could think of other businesses, maybe a construction firm.
Or pharmaceuticals. You don't want people on the pharmaceutical factory floor just tinkering with the formulation, right? No, for sure. And I think this plays back to what we were discussing just before the podcast began about the simplistic application of an extreme position, right, which we not advocate. The principle, though, of everybody at every level being empowered to use their brain does follow. I think what systems you need around checks and balances around that, and around how and when decisions are approved and actioned. Because I suppose the point of collective intelligence is not the idea that everyone individually should act as a series of individual autocrats. It is actually the idea that they should come together and challenge and critique one another's thinking to make it strong and build that capability. As much as the thinking power is important, the forums and the facility to critique and challenge one another is also equally part of this.
If I'm a board member listening to this, I can see a light's just gone off in my head thinking, how are we doing as an organisation with our collective intelligence? And I'm curious to know whether you have a way of assessing when you go into a new board and you start sort of helping them thinking these things through, with how to assess where they are and then how to track their progress.
We often point out that there are three core characteristics of an organisation that's set up well for collective intelligence: are the facility to think critically, communicate that critical thinking well, otherwise the fruits of that thinking just wither on the vine. And the third one is focus, the ability to align and focus all of that great thinking power around a common goal. And a really good tell or litmus test as to the presence of these three characteristics is often the board deck, the board pack. It's the canary in the coal mine. So if you're a board director trying to get a sense and trying to take the temperature of your organisation, which may be a large multinational spread out all around the world, pretty difficult task. But if your board papers do not surface critical thinking, if your board papers are a great big dump of backward-looking information, not insight, not the why, the so what, the now what, then you might want to question whether that critical thinking skill is missing. If the information is poorly communicated, again, vast tome of dry, stodgy prose, hard to wade through. Again, you might want to question whether that's indicative of the communication skills that may be missing. And if it's not clear what the focus is if it's not clear, having read your board papers cover to cover, if it's not clear what really matters right now, what the critical issues are and what the goals are and the objectives, if that's not coming through clearly, then again, it's a pretty good smoke signal that the management team are not clear themselves on what that focus is.
Can you bring to life what exactly that means, critical thinking, in the context of a board paper? Mm-hmm. What would be a case which would clearly illustrate for you that had happened?
So the sorts of things that would imply the absence of critical thinking. So it would be, you read a proposal, a business case presented to you, and there are critical gaps in the case that's presented. So for instance, somebody has set out, here's my recommendation, but they haven't presented the options. They've set out what all the benefits of supporting their course of action would be, but they haven't articulated the risks and how they propose to mitigate them. So basically, one of the things we look for is it rigorous? Does it cover all the critical bases? Does it present information, or does it pull out the why, the so what, the now what? Does it really get to the nub of the issue?
Can you give me an example of something where that doesn't have the why, and then what the why would be?
A lot of board papers, they'll fall into two camps. You'll have your proposals and your business cases, but then you'll have quite a lot of reports that speak to the past and performance today. In those, there's often a lot of information being shared, right? A lot of data, a lot of stuff that has happened between the period when the board last convened and today. But again, that information which might set out, sales targets were off by 5%. Well, first of all, is that material? Secondly, why? What was it within the business that didn't perform as planned? Next up, so what? Does it mean we're going to miss our target for the year, or does it mean we're quite likely to make that up? And finally, now what? What's the action we propose in response?
Got it. And if you identify this as a board member, how do you go about changing that?
Right. Einstein once said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend the first 55 minutes working out the question at the heart of it, because once I've figured out the question, I can answer it in 5 minutes. Questions are the spark and the fuel of curiosity, critical thinking, creativity. Behind pretty much every discovery or invention lies a question that no one else thought to ask. So building that habit of asking more and better questions in the management team is the device through which we trigger critical thinking. The good news is we're all born questioners, right? Small children apparently ask over 100 questions a day. But by the time we make it to the workplace, by the time we emerge from our formal education system, it's all but beaten out of us. And we live in a society that places value on knowing the answers, not on working out the question that needed to be asked in the first place. So a lot of what we're doing is helping to relearn questioning habit and to get our questioning mojo back. And once you've done that, once you build that culture and habit of questioning, you can unleash this power of critical thinking. And I suppose, as with any change management, it's easy to say, but how do you make it stick, right? How do you get people to do it? And like any such change, you need to make it easy to do and hard to avoid. We hijack the ritual of reporting, whether it's reporting up to your main board, whether it's reporting to a management quarterly business review, putting together the annual plan for the year ahead, all of those set piece activities, calendarized activities that are already in everybody's calendars through the year. We turn the preparation for those set piece activities into the place for questioning and deep critical thinking.
So if I've understood, you create a bit of a framework for those processes that means people can't avoid asking those questions and going through that critical thinking.
Exactly. To help get the culture embedded, to help get the habit normalized, we often build out sets of questions that are universally effective to make it easy to get started. The most powerful questions are almost always the simplest ones. So questions like, what are we trying to achieve? What's going well? What's not? What are the risks and opportunities on the horizon? And where does this leave us? What do we need to stop doing, start doing, or do differently? And what's my confidence in achieving our goals? And throughout all of that, why, so what, now what? And to build that habit of asking oneself those questions, we often recommend sets of questions, which we call QDI plays, question-driven insight plays, so that management can pick up one of these question sets, get familiar, get into the habit of interrogating themselves. And then over time, you can iterate around them, identifying other questions that you think are really important that need to be asked right now. Once you've built that foundation and that normalized the idea of questioning.
You make it sound so easy. Does anyone who implements this still struggle and still get it wrong?
Oh, I think the struggle is the point. It is hard. It's easy to ask the question. It's often hard to get to the nub of the answer. And when I say it's easy to ask the question, it's not that people do naturally. They don't, right? Naturally, management reports are a function of grab all the data available, shove it in a report, serve it up, right? This idea that you spend time as a management team member critiquing yourself with the challenging questions is not what a lot of people are in the habit of doing. But asking the question is sometimes the easy bit. Getting to the nub of it takes time. But when you look at projects or business plans that succeed, it's that struggle is part of the value. So very much an advocate of think slow, act fast. Once the more time you invest in the thinking up front, understanding the nub of the issue that you're grappling with, thinking more deeply about second and third order consequences of your actions, the greater the chances that you're going to succeed in execution. So whilst I think it is engaging the grey matter that might otherwise have lain a bit dormant, it can feel quite hard, like any workout, any mental workout, like a physical one. But it will ultimately help you go further, faster.
I can think of some CEOs I've worked with as a board member push back on that sort of approach. And they'd say, look, we just want to get on with it. You're just adding friction to what we're doing. And I guess they probably would think of themselves as more of the biologists in the sort of Matthew Syed physicists versus biologists. Physicists design things from first principles. Biologists just chuck stuff at the wall and see and A/B test and iterate. And sometimes one approach works better than the other. To your point earlier of, everything, in moderation, is this one that does require balance, or do you think actually this is one where, without question, people need to put in that preparation, that 95% of their time in the understanding the issue before actually executing.
I suppose you could reframe that as almost the potential for analysis paralysis and for thinking. And there's a strong case made for bias to action. And I remember a client of mine once saying, he was a chairman of many city organisations, but he'd been a military commander before his professional city career. And he said, if you're trying to cross a bog, don't stop, keep moving. And when you hit a crisis in business, it can be very tempting to put it out to analysis and do the research and mull over the options. But by the time you come up for air, you're basically sunk. So sometimes you need to just act, right? I buy that, I get that. However, I think in the modern working world, most of us are probably more guilty of being busy fools. Again, it's about that, where that pendulum sits, right? And I think an awful lot of professional lives spent running from pillar to post, from one board meeting to the next, barely a minute to stop and think. And a great illustration of this, we share the story in the book of Frank Gehry and his successful project at building the Bilbao Museum in Spain. And he speaks to the success of that project, which was delivered on time, on budget, and massively outperformed the intended benefits, which is pretty unheard of for any large infrastructure project, as we all know. And he credits a lot of his success with spending longer than anyone else in his profession on grappling with why this project was being commissioned in the first place, really trying to get under the skin of it to establish the correct brief, which was not the brief he was originally presented with, and spending a lot longer on getting the plans together before they broke ground and started executing. And he compares and contrasts that to the story of the Sydney Opera House, where apparently building works began when the designs were described by somebody as being little more than a doodle. But there was such a bias for action and such a sense that if we're not breaking ground, we're not really doing anything. And that can be your undoing. But I guess to your point, it's a balance of the extremes. I think generally we are too far on the other end of the spectrum these days.
I love that example that you gave of Frank Gehry in the book. And you talked about how he was 0.5%, or the 0.5% of the sort of 60,000 public projects actually get completed on time and on budget. You talked the importance of having the right people on the board, having the right information surface through the right board papers, and the right rituals. I'm obsessed about rituals at the moment, inspired by Reid Hoffman, who identified 8 that he saw common to all the best boards that he worked with. Are there any that stand out for you? There are a couple actually I picked up from the book that I love, one of which was bringing together the divergent topics and bringing together the convergent topics and making sure you weren't switching between the two, so that you allowed people's train of thinking to stay in flow and not have the task switching cost, which was brilliant. But are there what are the rituals that stand out for you of the highest performing boards that you see?
Yeah, and that point, by the way, about the divergent and convergent is very much back to these two different jobs of supervising and steering. Supervising being critiquing, needling, challenging management, and that steering role being much more expansive thinking and much more creative, much more linking arms with management. And they are kind of oil and water, trying to intersperse one agenda item of the one sort with another agenda item of the other sort. It's a really challenging switching role. So better to separate them into 2 separate meetings on 2 separate days. But if you can't, at least have a good break between the 2 groups. Another one would be frame every agenda item around the question at the heart of it that you want to have a conversation about. And sometimes, again, that's hard. It's quite hard to work out what is the central question here that we want to discuss with the board. But until you've figured that out, you haven't really figured out what you need from the information flow to support it. Because if you're not sure what conversation that paper is supposed to enable, then how can you give an appropriate brief to the person you're asking to prepare the paper?
How do the best boards get to those questions? My experience as a CEO is sometimes it could be quite difficult doing it on your own in isolation, and I really benefit from being able to kick ideas and doing it iteratively.
Yeah.
And often we'll have a sort of a 1-2 day session. At the end of that, we finally figured out what it was that we should be talking about, and then we have to have another sort of 1-2 day session later on to actually tackle that. But what do you see the best boards doing?
There will be standing items, but again, what's the critical question at the heart of them, which might be, what do we need to stop doing, start doing, or do differently? There can be some questions this month at meeting to meeting, and then others where it is a unique situation that's coming to the board, and you need to spend time on that. It's probably one of the biggest causes of wasted time in management, spent drafting a paper, surfacing that draft to say the sponsor reads the paper and says, no, this is all wrong. And it's not that it's a bad paper, it's just answering the wrong questions. But no question is articulated. They're just told it's completely wrong. And again, something vague is articulated as a try again. So the management goes back, tries again, drafts another paper, serves it up to the sponsor, who again isn't happy with it, but can't quite put their finger on why. And we've done various studies looking at the hidden cost of board reporting and the many, many rounds of iteration that go on beneath the surface, using up a lot of very senior management time, trying to get to the information that's needed for the board. Much better to spend a little bit longer at board level with management, agreeing what the central question or questions are. That is then a meaningful brief that management can then take away and engage in.
Have you got a good way for determining how to strike that balance? Because sometimes there's nothing worse than turning up at a board meeting where someone hasn't already done some of the pre-thinking, and ideally you do have a pre-read to facilitate and stimulate the discussion that happens. So it feels like you need to strike a balance. How do the best boards do that?
Yeah, I would say that actually another ritual is provide your board with a short briefing document in advance. Don't waste board time with PowerPoint presentations. Not only is it a poor use of the time of the people you've got gathered together in the room, but you're also at risk of being swayed by the design skills or the charismatic presentation skills of the person delivering it, whereas that pre-briefing needs to be self-explanatory and the quality of the thinking needs to stand on its own 2 feet or not. And so we'd strongly advocate that in advance. But you're right, there is a conversation to be had before the paper is drafted to get to the nub of what the brief is. And then if that paper is well put together, it will stimulate a much higher quality of conversation in the boardroom. And I suppose the most important ritual of all, the board meeting, in our view, isn't something that happens in the board meeting at all. It is the discipline it presents to management of engaging in and taking on that thinking challenge. It's the discipline imposed on management of needing to spend time engaging in those difficult questions and getting to the nub of the answers. I know that myself, having just prepared my board meeting yesterday and a week or so before, feeling pretty confident at this stage in the year that we're pretty clear what our strategy is. I've delivered umpteen presentations to the team over the last couple of months as we've iterated together on that strategy. I was pretty confident I knew what our strategy was until I sat down and tried to write that paper. And then I find, actually, I'm not that clear at all. And there are all sorts of gaps in my thinking, all sorts of wrinkles that need to be ironed out. And it was the process of externalizing that thinking for the purpose of crafting my board paper that forced me to face up to those gaps or those wrinkles and do the thinking necessary to close those gaps and iron out the wrinkles and present a much better plan to the board for the benefit of it. So I suppose for us, the real win is when management get value from the process of engaging in deep critical thinking, crafting their board papers, and the board is then a nice secondary beneficiary of that.
So I'm imagining a board member listening to this who's got a CEO that they're working with and supporting, who's struggling with how to get their strategy papers right for their board. I want to get the exact detail of how, what you think best practice looks like and maybe what you do for getting those board papers. Is it first as a CEO, you go out and you start socializing your ideas with your team, or you get them to bubble up the ideas. You then sort of start to frame that as the CEO. You'd then start discussing it with a board member or board members informally. You'd then write a paper and then bring that to board and then have the discussion, or what is the sequencing of events?
As somebody being tasked with crafting the submission to the board at any stage in that process, spend some time with the board agreeing the questions you're going to answer in your briefing paper. Agree on those questions. I'll give you another example of where this didn't happen. We had a client who had on their board a former chief exec who was now a non-exec of another company in that same sector. And as a former operator, he had a big appetite for data, loved data. And he would request from management every product line or data relating to every product line in every one of their markets, performance data, for him to see exactly what the sales, the profitability, and the manufacturing capacity, all sorts of data relating to every single one of their and that would create an extra 30 extra pages that would be tacked into their board deck every month. Management hated it because it didn't just bloat the board deck. It also added this potential risk of who knows what question coming at them, blindsiding them in the board meeting from this non-exec who'd spent the previous week or so slicing and dicing this data set every which way, looking for interesting correlations and so on, things that management might have missed. So they hated it. And it presented a lot of work for him, actually. And the rest of the board didn't much like it because, again, it added bulk to the board pack and gave them the sense they ought to be reading it. But of course, they didn't have time and they weren't. So we spent a bit of time with him and we said to him, okay, what is the question that you're grappling with here? When you ask management for this data set, tell us what's really on your mind. What are the questions you're trying to answer? And he said to us very honestly, I don't know. Give me a minute. Let me try and figure it out. You go down to the staff cafeteria and give me 10, 15 minutes. Come back and I'll see if I can answer that question for you. So we did. We came back. And he'd written down just a very small number of questions he'd written down. First of all, which of our product lines are making us money? Which of them are positive contributors? Which of them are negative contributors? And where are we putting more of our manufacturing capacity? Are we putting more of our capacity into the ones that are making us money? Or, as I fear, are we putting more capacity into the ones that are losing us money? And if we are, is that for good reason? Is it because we're trying to pump prime a new product line, for example, or we're trying to go harder, a bit of competition in the market and take them out? What is the rationale? Now, those were very simple questions. We were able to answer the first two questions in one simple chart at the top of a kind of a third of an A4 sheet of paper. And the answer to his final questions about where we are putting extra capacity into the product lines that seem to be losing us money, why? Is it for good reason? That was answered in narrative in a way that he wasn't getting the answers from this giant 20, 30 page data set anyway. So what he ended up with was a single page of A4 that spoke to some absolutely critical questions that were on his mind and that everybody around the boardroom table, exec and non-exec, agreed were very valid questions that they should have all been asking, but hadn't. So I think once you get to the nub of what are the critical questions here, you can often serve up a much higher quality answer and do the thinking that needed to get done that might have otherwise gotten overlooked than if you just rush off and start preparing information.
Got it. And so if you apply that to the strategy set, who takes the first crack at the first set of questions typically in your experience? Is it the chair or is it the CEO or is it someone else?
The CEO in most organizations is the one originating the strategy as one of our, actually, I remember on our cap table used to put it, it's John Egan who says it's the job of the board to widen management's thinking, not to do the thinking for them. So typically it's led by the executive, but that doesn't mean you can't have a conversation with the board to test yourself, to say, I think these are the critical questions we need to answer in this year's strategy. Do we agree? Have I missed anything?
And where does the CEO typically go first when they first put those questions down? Are they first going to sense check those with their executive or are they first going to check them with the chair?
So I think normally, certainly in the businesses that we work with, usually management have been through a few iterations of this themselves already, grappling with a few critical questions, working up what they think is the right response to that, and then sharing that and testing that with either members of the board or the chair before iterating again to formalise that.
And will they typically do that informally outside of the boardroom with the chair or board members, or will the first step actually be in the board?
I would agree that an awful lot of the work of the board is not done in the boardroom. And there are definitely different opinions on this. There are some who feel quite aggrieved at the idea that there are side conversations going on that not everybody is privy to. But I think it would be really quite naive to expect all really big decisions to be taken in a small number of hours locked in a wood-panelled room. I think that would feel pretty reckless to me. So a lot of conversations should and do go on outside the boardroom, particularly with the chair and the chief exec most often. Ideally, they're in fairly constant dialogue.
I was very struck by one of our recent podcast guests, Professor Andrew Kakabadze, who portrayed the role of the chair and CEO as very much at the heart of the whole board dynamic and the non-execs on the outside. So if I sort of adopt that model, I would expect the CEO and the chair to be iterating questions offline and then actually bringing it to the board and keeping the non-execs reasonably independent so they could then bring the fresh perspective, the independent perspective, having not been as close to it. Is that how you see it? Or
I mean, I like that idea. It's kind of interesting. I do think there's a phrase I've often had come to mind of it. There's no such thing as a good or bad board, just a good or bad chair. I think chairs are obviously really critical, but it depends where your business is, what its challenges are. If you've got certain skills and experience around the boardroom table that could be additive in helping you engage in the thinking, it's your strategy. Why don't you engage them, right? I don't think it's necessary to have a rule that you don't engage with your board in that way. I get as much value from my board as I possibly could. A chair of one of my clients would ask every board member, non-execs, to craft a 250 manifesto every year, articulating what the value they brought to their boarders and what their vision for the board is for the next year. I don't think I'm hugely in favour of too many black and white rules around what board members do or don't do.
We've touched a little bit on communication, and in the book you talk about how many of us have been taught in ways that often gets in the way of good communication. And you've touched on using sort of written papers. Are there any other things that you see as being very common mistakes for boards to make on that communication front?
In the book, we identify 5 communication conventions that are often drilled into us through our formal education that are wholly unhelpful in the working world. So these are 5 communication conventions that we consign to the bin and that we replace with 5 new ones, better ones. One of those conventions, convention number 3, serious subjects demand formal writing. We don't think so. Instead, we believe you should write like a human, no matter what you're writing about. So quite often when people are asked to prepare a paper for the board or for any forum that's got some sort of weight to it, they want to communicate the seriousness with which they're taking this task and their respect for the audience, and they find themselves in honour of that, writing in a very formal tone of voice, kind of like a lawyer or maybe even a robot wrote it, and they find themselves using very long words where short ones would have done. But turns out that if you use a long word where a short simple word would have done the job, you actually sound less smart. Secondly, to be on the receiving end, lots of very formal, dry, impersonal prose. It's really hard to get through. And thirdly, probably most importantly, it puts distance between you and your message. And the number one thing boards or any decision-making group is looking for is leadership and accountability in the person who's tabling that information set. So if I'm presenting a report to my board, if our performance was not what we'd hoped it should be, it's quite tempting to fall back on the passive voice and impersonal style of writing. So it's quite tempting to say sales targets were missed. Much better, we missed our sales targets. Own the message, good or bad. Communicate that accountability. Communicate and evidence leadership, and your reader is far more likely to root for you, whether that message is fundamentally a good one or not. Always use your voice, write like a human.
Do you think that really makes an impact? I can't remember who the politician was, and they tried to, ape the practice, I think it was of Churchill, who sent round the document of what good copy looks like, and they got laughed out the houses because it was sort of like, what is this person doing, getting upset about dotting I's and crossing T's when we got some serious issues to deal with? I mean, could you see practical evidence of where this has really had impact?
All the time. So you pick up a report. I wish I could show you a couple, but obviously they're highly confidential. A report written by a senior business leader, speaking in plain English, using their voice, talking about the things on their mind, the challenges they're grappling with, the issues they're trying to resolve, and how they plan to resolve them. You contrast that to a report that reads like it was generated by a computer, utterly impersonal and dry. You get no sense of the person behind the paper. And ultimately, what you're doing every time as a board member, you're trying to judge, do we have the right people in this business to solve these problems? You're always trying to get a sense of, do we have the people we need, right? Even if that's not the explicit question, it's the constant implicit question. The one lever the board can pull is fire the chief exec, right? It's pretty much the only one, and cast judgment on the quality of the rest of the leadership team. So to not surface that, and it is a tell, it is another of these smoke signals or canaries in the coal mine, that you have a management team that lacks accountability when they present reports in this way, that's putting as much distance as possible from themselves and their messages. It's indicative of a cultural malaise that you can see clearly coming through in the board papers. But going back to the point you made about the politician, I remember this. I think it was Rees-Mogg. And I am no defender of Rees-Mogg, far from it. And it's always frustrating when you hear, I'm a classicist, and I've spent the last few years wincing at Boris Johnson, in my view, kind of ruining it for me. Everyone asked by all his references to, Latin sayings and so on. But no, I think there was, in this one example, a lot of truth to what Rees-Mogg was talking about. And he was probably referencing Churchill's memos written in 1940, just as the Battle of Britain was raging. Bombs were falling over London every night. And Churchill dictates a memo to his PA, to his secretary, a memo begging or beseeching all of the people that write memos for him to write shorter, clearer memos. At a time of existential national crisis, he decided this mattered because what he recognised was that it didn't matter how good the military intelligence was. It didn't matter how good the battle plans and the military thinking was. if they couldn't communicate it clearly, it wasn't going to cut through. And they risked, in this case, a matter of life and death. And I think he was right. There's no good doing great thinking if you can't communicate it clearly. You're unlikely to get the support and the collaboration that your thinking needs to be acted on well.
You finished the book with a chapter titled When It All Goes Wrong, and you threw a fly into the ointment right at the end. Should board members listening to this take from that?
Our thesis in the book is both hopefully coherent, certainly believed to be true, which is if you get everybody thinking critically, communicating that thinking well, and focused on what matters most, good things will follow. But real life is messy, and real life serves up a lot of situations, examples where that hasn't worked. Right? Give an example. Harry Markopoulos, he was a fund manager. And one day his boss said to him, I want you to go check out this other fund that seems to be performing a lot better than we are. I want you to go take a look at what it is they're doing. And I want a bit of that. I want a bit of that, thank you. I want a bit of their performance. So he went off and had a look, and he found this fund. It was called Fund, run by somebody called Bernie Madoff. And he took a look at it, and he said it took him about 4 minutes to figure out this was a fraud. And it took him another 4 hours to mathematically prove it was a fraud. So he wrote a memo to the SEC, and he did a 20 or 21-page memo titled, The World's Biggest Hedge Fund is a Fraud. He sent it off to the SEC, and we all know what happened. Nothing. So, first off, critical thinking. Secondly, well communicated. Tick. Thirdly, focused on what matters most. Tick. And the point here for boards is our thesis doesn't work in pocket. Everybody in the system needs to be open to engaging with difficult questions, open to hearing difficult, challenging, new information. And unless you can get everybody to work in that way, you risk what happened to Harry Markopoulos. So it needs to be cultural. A really good place to start is in the boardroom and with the senior management team and the way they work, feeding up into the boardroom. But you need to take it from there all the way down through the organisation. Otherwise, you risk great thinking landing on deaf ears.
Are there practical steps you could take if you're a chair listening to this and thinking, ooh, how do I make sure we don't suffer belief perseverance in our boardroom? How do you prevent and inoculate yourself against it?
I think it is building a culture of ask difficult questions and normalising that. And by difficult questions, I don't mean questions designed as weapons. I don't mean questions to make you look clever for asking them. The most challenging questions are often the simple questions that we forget to ask. But normalising asking those questions and spending time getting to the nub of the issue, getting to the nub of the answer. And once that becomes normalised, you can go a long way. Satya Nadella says that when he took over, was it around 2011, 2012, around that time, he took over as chief exec of Microsoft. He said, I inherited an organisation of world-class experts, but he went on to describe what he needed from work, a culture of world-class questioners, world-class learners. And he credits much of the success, and gosh, they've had a lot of success, but a lot of the success of Microsoft was being this tremendous cultural shift away from this idea that everybody, that you go to the expert for the answer. Instead, it's everybody's job to engage in the difficult questions. Nobody has a monopoly on the next good idea or the next thought, the next insight or the next challenging question. It's everybody's job. So I think it absolutely can be done. You can shift a culture, and boardroom's a great place to start.
You referenced in the book the living laboratory of your own business. One of the things that has always challenged me is I don't feel like we've got our own board right when we're, that is our area of supposed expertise and we still haven't got it perfect. Do you feel you've got the board right for your own organisation? And if not, why not?
I get a huge amount of value from our board. Where I go looking for challenge and advice doesn't begin or end with our board. It's a part of that picture. I think when I think about living laboratory of our business and perhaps the mistakes we've made, one of them is probably that I'm a big believer, as the book suggests, in collective intelligence and everybody being empowered to use their brains, use them well. Pippa and I run the business, probably not that way inclined when we set the business up, right? Both workaholics, pretty fanatical about detail, and not natural delegators, right? And therefore not naturally empowering for other people. But we both suffer the same affliction of a womb, and we both got pregnant at various stages. In fact, at one point, both pregnant at the same time, and had maternity leave at the same time, which forced us to empower our leadership team to run the business in our absence. And the business grew at its fastest rate when we went off on maternity leave, which was a very good data point that maybe we weren't quite as essential in all ways as we maybe thought we were. And perhaps there's something to be said for actually giving other people a little bit more space to use their brains too. And that prompted us to build up a much stronger, richer style of engagement and empowerment through the organisation, much more collective than perhaps it might have been if we hadn't had to disappear off for a period of time.
Jen, the time has flown by, which means it's time for a lightning round where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready. The boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
Grandstanding. So abusive questions, asking questions to make you look smart rather than to progress the thinking of the group.
The best book every board member should read, and why? Of course, they should all read Collective Intelligence.
Good point. That should be the answer. But if in addition to Collective Intelligence, Factfulness by Hans Rosling, it's a book that reminds you that you don't know as much as you think you do, but it makes you hungry for knowledge, hungry to think and learn.
Your favourite quote and why?
Nihil nimis, nothing in excess, but applied not so much to consumption, where it's also true, but applied to the views that we hold. So extreme positions, tightly held, scare me.
Your most significant professional insight?
Own your agenda. Somebody once said to me, fire yourself on Friday and come back as your replacement on Monday. But better still, as an investor in Board Intelligence who sadly passed away a few years, he once said to me, don't just be chief exec of your business, be chief exec of your life.
What would you change about the working world?
Men would take equal paternity leave to women. They have the right today, they just don't take it.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
They are far more socially minded than I might have assumed.
What's something people commonly misunderstand about you?
I'm not competitive, but that doesn't make me any less ambitious.
And finally, 3 things that those listening should take away from this if they take nothing else.
Number 1, board reports are the canary in the coal mine. If there's an absence of critical thinking, clear communication or focus, you can be pretty sure it's missing from the management team. Secondly, questions are the catalyst for critical thinking. So build a culture of world-class questioners, not world-class experts. And thirdly, one of the most important jobs of the board is to create the conditions for everyone in the organisation to think well, not just the board.
Jen, it is always such a pleasure catching up with you, and I'm so pleased to be able to share your huge experience and clarity of thought with all those listening. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@nurole.com. That's podcast@nurole.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening, and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.